when we think of sustainability, even the term sustainability that was a trend decades ago now seems a bit outdated in the sense of sustaining the current conditions to not be enough anymore. So then the question for us is, if we need to regenerate the environment, what is the role of architecture on that? It's not a simple question, and we are not talking about implementing more gardens in the city, right? It needs to go way beyond that.
In a world increasingly facing the challenges of climate change, with the Building Green podcast, we will dive deep into the intersection of architecture, design, urbanism, and environmental responsibility. I'm Ladina Schipp, your host. I've been an architect and building site manager for the past 10 years. During my studies at ETH in Switzerland, as well as in my working environment, I've had many touchpoints with sustainability, like many of you, I guess. I've also learned to question what I've been told, which is why I decided to go deeper into the topic and uncover what sustainability actually means. My mission is to highlight the transformative power of sustainable architecture, not just as a practice, but as a catalyst for broader societal change. Subscribe for more of our content and enjoy the show. So welcome to today's episode of Building Green, where we explore the fusion of architecture, sustainability, and humanity. I'm joined by Fabiano Sartori, a leader in sustainable urban planning and humanitarian action with over 15 years of experience across the globe. In this episode, we dive into your journey into the heart of sustainable development and how you're leveraging architecture for environmental and social change. So Fabiano, with a 15-year journey in urban planning and sustainable development across different continents, can you share your story and tell me how has your path shaped your commitment to sustainability in architecture and urban planning?
Yeah, for sure. Well, first of all, thanks a lot for having me. It's fantastic to be here with you in that podcast. So this is quite a long story, which also tells a bit about my age, I would say. But it all started with some reflections and some practical exercises still during college on what could be the contributions of architecture and urban planning on social transformations. During this period, we were experimenting with some academic activities in collaboration with NGOs, for example. And then through time, as it's quite common on an architectural career, let's say, I worked with several types of activities, from building design to graphic design, lighting design, working on construction sites, and all sorts of things. And through time, I started to get more and more interested on the climate and environmental dimensions of architecture, or what we would call back there sustainable architecture as a broad term. So I was looking for ways of learning about it and working with it. After some experiences in the private sector, I was running a design studio with a partner, a fantastic one, by the way.
And in Brazil, right?
In Brazil, exactly. And we were trying to figure out ways of doing that in putting together, let's say, the social components and the environmental components into practice, while obviously making a bit of money to pay the bills. And that's exactly the challenge, right? That's where we faced so much challenge in terms of how to bring these ideas, how to bring this approach to the market. And in the end, we managed to develop some very interesting projects, small scale ones. For example, with a local NGO, we developed a school for underprivileged neighborhoods and communities. And these practices were giving us a lot of excitement. But at the same time, the equation wasn't really addressed, let's say. Basically, what were paying the bills was very traditional way of producing architecture. And then after a while, I took a decision to change the way and the scale of working with architecture, and I moved it to the public sector. I started working for an environmental department in Brazil as an architect in urban planning. And this was what was almost like going to college again, because I had the chance to work in different departments inside of this one, from environmental licensing to management of conservation units and the design of building and infrastructures for these areas, for example. And I worked with different expertise, from biologists to forest engineers to sociologists and so on and so forth. So this gave me a much broad perspective on the interrelationship between climate, environment, and architecture and urban planning, especially understanding how these green areas, for example, that we were managing by the time, were playing a fantastic role in terms of improving the living conditions and the ecological conditions of the cities. Um, and then after a while, working more focused on sustainability, and I did two masters during this period because I was really trying to learn and gain a bit of knowledge on these different areas to be able to dialogue and work together with this expertise. I was missing the social part. I thought that by working for the government, I would have more access to a social impact in a different scale. And this was there, but not exactly the way I expected. And this was in my heart since the beginning. And then I bet in a different change and another change once again. And I left this position and moved to Barcelona to do a third master in international cooperation and sustainable emergency architecture. And with the idea of diving into the humanitarian sector, because I thought, well, might be the way of, again, pay the bills and have the chance to be involved with uh, the communities that are most in need, the communities that in general doesn't have access to any type of architectural service. Um, and then the master was the way through it, let's say. And during the master, I fell in love with human mobility as a broad topic and the whole situation of displaced communities and refugees, and how these generate a certain type of human settlement that, as an architect and urban planner, I was really shocked by what was going on, and at the same time understanding that we should have a role to play without yet knowing exactly how. And then since then, my career has been built exactly on these thread, let's say, on these relationship between architecture and urban planning, with a focus on refugee camps, emergent settlements, and stuff like this, climate and environment, and the whole conversation around the sustainability and human mobility in the context of humanitarian action. And here we are.
It's funny. So you were looking for a way of making money with your architecture studio, and you ended up doing 3 masters instead.
Yeah, it sounds
really
sounds a contradiction, right? Yeah.
Now, I'm really looking forward to talking to you. As I already told you before, I had an interview a few weeks ago with the disaster management in Cape Town. So I'm really trying to look for contradictions or some kind of pattern, because she was not an architect, but we were really well amazed by how connected these two topics are. So you have been at the forefront of integrating sustainability with humanitarian action, especially now in your role with the Danish Refugee Council. Could you dive into how your work in humanitarian architecture and planning has impacted communities facing crisis, particularly in the context of environmental sustainability?
Okay, this is a bit complex. I guess more important than to talk about the impact of my activities specifically, because I don't believe that we have this individual role, let's say. I believe that we should be part of a movement. So we can talk about the impact of these organizations in general. So there are different ways of looking at these intersections. So the first one, obviously, is the type of solutions we adopt on emergency responses. From the very first days in a crisis, it might be a conflict, a displacement related to a conflict or a disaster, to the long-term solutions. So these settlements that in general they are set up as emergency response solutions, emergency shelters, for example, gradually they tend to become urbanized areas. In terms of how these settlements evolve, it's extremely critical, and it involves a lot of political, social, cultural, economic conditions and factors influencing. This means, in practical terms, that most of the refugee camps will um, remain for decades after the implementation. So the functionalities and the setup of these solutions change through time, and architects and urban planners, among with a range of different expertise, of course, has an important role in terms of how we improve these living conditions, although facing very strict restrictions in terms of what is possible in terms of implementation. So understanding this evolution through time, it's key to our work. But we also need to bear in mind that when we think of the displaced communities as a whole, we have a larger number of refugees and IDPs living in urban settings instead of refugee camps, for example. That is the first thing that comes to our minds when we think of a refugee, right? So what happens from an urban planning perspective, from urban policies, when cities are welcoming, hosting a large number of refugees and IDPs? So this is another very important conversation. And then when we think of the climate crisis, first of all, these communities, because most of them are crossing borders or being displaced internally in their own countries, crossing border to neighboring countries, uh, they are massively in the global south or in countries without high capacities to invest and to protect and welcome these displaced communities. This means that they are not only the most vulnerable and exposed to the impacts of climate change, but also with the fewer resources to cope with these impacts. So then we have what we call compounding crisis. We have situations where the socioeconomic conditions are degrading, while these communities have been hit by disasters and slow onset processes such as droughts that are also disrupting livelihoods, practice, and all these. So this generates a very, very complex scenario that obviously involves how these settlements would be will evolve through time.
Very interesting. Could you compare the different approaches between the refugee camps, as most of us think of, and the urban settlements?
Yeah, for sure. What we need to bear in mind is that these solutions are, although in general terms we have lots of standards defined by the humanitarian community, these solutions are pretty contextual because obviously they are the result of the political environment as well. So when we think of urban settings, we have a dispersion of displaced communities that obviously are trying as much as possible to socioeconomically integrate. Everyone wants to have autonomy. No one wants to be dependent on any kind of humanitarian assistance. So we have these very complex scenarios where displaced communities are disputing access to housing, to land, to property, to access to these very basic needs in contexts where you tend to have social inequality in local communities also struggling to access. So, from a humanitarian perspective, a humanitarian organization perspective, the question is how can we advocate, how can we dialogue, how can we build partnerships with states, with the private sector, with local communities in terms of ensuring the access and improving the conditions for both communities at the same time, the host and affected communities and the displaced communities. And then from an architecture and urban planning perspective, this means that we should look at the stock of buildings and flats and the whole infrastructure already existing to understand what is possible in terms of using existing infrastructure to provide this access. Because not only we move faster, but we also move with reduced climate and environmental impacts. That's the ideal situation. So this is one way of dealing with this challenge. But when we think of refugee camps, in most of the cases, they are implemented in quite isolated areas. In terms of logistics, for example, it's a tremendous challenge. And then the type of solution in terms of architecture and urban planning that you are capable of implementing, it's pretty limited. And this is important because sometimes we question some of the technical solutions, and of course they should be questioned because there's always room for improvement. But in most of the cases, the limitations are not exactly coming from the specific material or technical solution you are adopting. It's coming from a more complex system that doesn't allow you to go much further than this in terms of what to adopt and what to design for these situations. And then in refugee camps, what we're going to see in the early days is an effort by hosting communities, states, or humanitarian organizations in terms of providing the very basics. So we are talking about shelter, we are talking about water, sanitation, and hygiene facilities. We are talking about the very minimum in terms of surviving. And then the question is how this evolves through time.
So you mentioned the questioning of the technical details. So in your role, how can you reduce environmental impact more specifically?
It depends to what we are talking about. When I work with humanitarian organizations in terms of supporting them on the incorporation of climate and environment as cross-cutting topics, we are discussing not only the very classical infrastructural and construction services around architecture and urban planning, but all types of activities. So the first thing we need to bear in mind is that one thing is to reduce the impacts of our own operations, our facilities, our logistics, our procurement procedures, our supply chain, and so on and so forth. Another thing is the operation. It's how we reduce the impacts of what we are providing, what we are implementing on the field. So we are going to find different ways of doing that. For example, the type of logistic we're going to use, how we're going to make it more sustainable, the type of food we're going to use, the type of means of transportation, and all that. How the warehouse would be assembled, where it would be assembled, and these tend to be a global effort because these goods are traveling all over the world to make possible the access to these communities. And then when we think of activities, we try to identify all the impacts and all the opportunities we have. So if we are implementing a shelter solution, for example, this will go from the materials we're going to use to the type of energy and the source of water and how we deal with waste, for example, in all these different levels. But something that we are doing as a humanitarian sector as a whole, trying to go beyond these basic solutions to reduce the environmental impacts, is to understand other levels of interaction and other ways of incorporating climate and environment. So, for example, the more we manage to incorporate climate data and climate analysis into the planning of humanitarian action, the more capable we are to be more preventive and invest in anticipatory action, invest more on disaster risk reduction measures. So then we start to work with these communities before something happens instead of responding to emergencies. This is just one example of how these things are interconnected. And we do need to be more preventive because due to the climate change, the scale of needs and the complexity of needs for the humanitarian sector is growing very fast, and there's no capacity to respond to all that. So the more preventive we are, the better we respond for sure.
And in maybe more in urban settlements, or maybe it also works for the camps, how do you feel about reusing spaces for temporary settlements instead of building new camps or using, I don't know, habitable space that is already there?
There are some very interesting solutions in that sense, but unfortunately, these are the exceptions. This is not the most traditional way of settling displaced communities in a urban setting. I would always advocate for this type of solution. First of all, because as we said, we are using an already implemented infrastructure that helps us to avoid generating new environmental impacts through the construction of new facilities and infrastructure related. We can go way faster. And there is something very important that is when you are using an existing facility or an existing space, there are more chances that this facility will be more integrated into the urban environment. This means that the displaced communities being hosted in these facilities will have a much better access to services, much better access to job opportunities if it's the case, because then we have legal components around that, of course, and they will be settled in situations that generates less isolation from a physical perspective. And this is important in terms of how we support building cohesion between the different communities. The more isolated, the more without access to information and knowing what's going on in these different settlements, the higher the risk that you might have, for example, uh, not so precise ideas or perceptions about the displaced communities, which obviously doesn't help in terms of social cohesion. So this is always a better solution. But in most of the cases, what we also see it's a lack of willingness especially from governments, because there is a certain tendency to understand the situations as very temporary, although we know, and the numbers shows that there's absolutely nothing temporary in these scenarios. We could call it a permanent temporariness. It's temporary, but it remains in this situation for decades. So the governments might be afraid of, by providing better conditions and better access and social integration, they will end up supporting the consolidation, and this might not be the political interest.
It's interesting, when during my studies at ETH, I had a semester with Kees Christianse, and it was just after they won the competition for the urbanism Olympic city in Hamburg in Germany. So we did a semester about that. And the whole semester exercise was this urban planning for the Olympic legacy, because of course an Olympic city is only used for a few months, or not even months, for a few weeks, but it's a whole city that you build. And there you really plan for what you do afterwards with it. And actually, well, you can't really plan for what you are doing because it's usually quite fast, right? But you could maybe give it more a focus of, okay, this is what we need right now, and how can we develop it for later, right?
You mean when we think of refugee camps and this type of settlement?
Yes.
Yeah, ideally yes, but the challenge is this almost philosophical perspective on it. That is, okay, we are assembling something that it's an emergency response, and the Olympic Games is it's a good example, because we could say that, well, it's an emergent solution in terms of we need an infrastructure to be able to host the games, and then it's over, right? Um, but we don't have control to how these things will develop. So what I believe could be a way of reflecting and eventually influencing how we operate is to work with the different scenarios. If we manage to design different scenarios, including from a political perspective, for example, if things evolve in the country of origin of the displaced community, that allows them to go back to their countries to through a voluntary and safe and assisted process of return, then these facilities, these spaces and infrastructures should evolve in this way. But we need to bear in mind that in most of the cases, we are not planning for something as we would plan for an Olympic Games, because you are elected many, many years before hosting the games. So you have a different cycle of planning. And the other thing is how much time you have to assemble something. And in some situations, if you think, for example, the Rohingya crisis in Bangladesh, in weeks, a few months max, Bangladesh received 700,000 ringgit. So when you have these massive movements, there's no planning for that. Obviously, countries, and we're seeing this more and more, especially due to climate change, because now we are predicting more human mobility caused by directly or indirectly by the climate change. Uh, Being more prepared for that in terms of policies and solutions, but in most of the cases, there's no much planning done in these hosting countries in terms of welcoming. So in the end, what happens in practice is that you are assembling something as an emergency response that needs to be really fast. You might be assembling these solutions in a few days or weeks, and then you will try to provide the bare minimum. And then after time, you might have the chance to start discussing, okay, how these infrastructures could evolve. There are, let's say, simple solutions, simple from a technical perspective, not a political one, to be clear. That is thinking of how these facilities could serve the underprivileged communities from the local communities. Because if you take Brazil, for example, we are responding to the Venezuelan crisis, and in the northern part of Brazil, we have several emergency shelters hosting Venezuelans. But we also know that the lack of access to housing in Brazil, it's massive. We do have a population in need of access. So these facilities, in another moment, depending on how the Venezuelan crisis evolved, these facilities could be used as transitional shelters for this population. So then you start addressing issues of homeless communities, for example, that would gain access to safety, to security, to better living conditions, not, of course, as a final solution, but as a transitional one that supports them to improve their health conditions, that gives them more conditions to start accessing job opportunities and so on and so forth, that later will lead to a long-term and proper condition in terms of housing. So these are the ways I believe we could reflect taking the Olympic Games as an example.
A few of you might know that I recently opened my own architecture studio, and I just started with the podcast. I'm very excited to build a platform where I connect with inspiring people to learn along the way and share these learnings with you. So if any little thing has inspired you, or if you learned anything new, I'd appreciate if you could rate the show or share my content on social media, Spotify or YouTube or wherever you listen to it. And if you think there are any touch points between you and me, I'd be super happy to connect with you. Feel free to reach out on any platform. So we now talked about long-term solutions. And how do you make sure during the beginning phases of these settlements, it can be the refugee camps or the urban settlements, how do you make sure those settlements are environmental friendly in terms of materials, in terms of urban planning, in terms of infrastructure?
It's really difficult, to tell the truth. What we are trying to do as much as possible is to improve the solutions while maintaining the capability of implementing things in a very fast way. So then we have different work streams, let's say. In one hand, we have, for example, if you think of the relief housing units, that it's a very simple and fast housing kit to assemble in emergency situations. Through time, better shelter that develops it has been improving the type of material and the solutions to try to reduce the waste generated, to try to increase the lifespan of these heats and that kind of thing. So then we maintain the necessity of assembling really fast while trying to improve the sustainability of these solutions. In parallel, we have some experiments in terms of introducing new techniques, especially nature-based solutions ones, that helps reducing these environmental impacts as well. So energy for cooking, for example, it's a huge challenge. We have massive process of deforestation in the surroundings of refugee camps because communities are obviously in need of fuel for cooking, for heating, and so on and so forth. So there are experiments with biodigesters, for example, that process organic waste and generate gas for cooking in a very sustainable way in the household level. So we have some solutions, and this is obviously just an example on how we can, through time, improve or increase the level of sustainability in this space. Again, the challenge with this type of innovation is to scale up, is to how to bring it to large scale settlements and populations. But it's a process going on, I would say. In terms of solarization, for example, of infrastructures and facilities, this is moving quite well, and now we have much more solutions in that sense in refugee camps.
And can you discuss a recent project where you faced significant challenges in green mainstreaming and how you overcame them?
One of the interesting challenges of how we incorporate or how we make humanitarian action more sustainable, it's how this goes hand in hand with the process of localization. What I mean by localization is that the humanitarian sector is trying to work more and more with local actors, supporting the increase of local capacities, while we also incorporate as much as possible the local knowledge, the local expertise and experiences. So this is a process of localization. And every time that we develop a specific project, for example, that will try to respond to specific needs of these communities through a climate and environmental perspective, we do our best to work with communities, including understanding what are their own interests and necessities and capacities. So to give you an example, in the border with Venezuela, we worked with indigenous communities, Brazilian indigenous communities that were hosting indigenous communities from Venezuela. For them, the border between the two countries simply doesn't exist. So they used to have a relationship way before the crisis. So welcoming them was almost a natural process for them, although it generated a very important impact in terms of resources for these hosting communities, especially in terms of access to food and production that they have inside of the territory. So then, these indigenous communities came to us with an idea of creating and producing fish in their territory. And they were trying by their own to assemble tanks and that kind of thing. So what we did was a capacity building process with local actors, with the communities, not only providing training sessions and materials, tools, and all that, but also assembling a large scale tank with them so then they could learn the techniques and all that. And this was obviously a project incorporating more sustainable solutions. So then we have solar panels for water pumping. We have a cycle of water that recycles the water. So the tank is integrated with vegetable gardens and other situations. So there's no waste of water in this process. A series of solutions. But then we faced a challenge in terms of how to combine these solutions that for us were quite innovative and sustainable with the local knowledge and traditions of these indigenous communities, especially from the perspective of operating and maintaining this structure through time. So these are the challenge, and this is a very small scale example to understand that although technology, innovation, new materials, all these plays a very important role in how we address climate and environment. Um, but we shouldn't put all our solutions in this basket, let's say, because technology will not solve all the problems. So we also need to be very innovative in terms of community engagement and participatory processes, for example, or how we work with communities instead of working for communities, and so on and so forth. So for me, the challenge go way beyond the technical solutions, and it's much more in terms of how we design the process that will generate the solutions we are willing to implement.
Very interesting. And you've also focused on advocacy and policy change. How can architects and urban planners play a more active role in advocating for environmental sustainability and policy change within their communities and beyond?
I guess this touches a little bit on how we see ourselves as architects and urban planners. Obviously, we have professionals in our field working in all sorts of scales, all type of activities, and lots of them are directly involved with policy design and all these, especially when we think of urban regulations and codes and all that. But at the same time, I have the feeling that the practice of architecture in the field of architecture is still quite attached to these very pleasant and joyful way of doing architecture that is designing a building, right? We have this passion for this scale, for example, and we have a passion for aesthetics, for example. So I guess what is needed from us as professionals and more than individuals, of course, because this is a collective effort. The only way is through collectiveness, right? Is to understand us as part of this very complex scenario of the climate crisis. So cities are extremely impacted by the climate crisis, and cities can also be the place where solutions are developed. And something that always made me passionate about architecture, it's exactly how our practice combine the different fields of knowledge. We are discussing from arts to mathematics, from science to materials to, in some cases, psychology, and so on and so forth. So I guess we have a very important contribution in how we understand the dynamics of a city, how a city functions, and these should influence policies in a very important way. We also need to play a role in how the real estate market, for example, dictate rules for how cities are also built. So from let's say this might sound a bit arrogant, but from an educational perspective, I guess we have a responsibility in terms of how we inform clients, how we inform businesses on the construction sector in terms of the role of these businesses in supporting how cities will adapt to the impacts of climate change and how we're going to mitigate the current impacts our activities are already generating. So policies are crucial because in the end, there's absolutely nothing really structural that individuals or companies individually can do. So we do need to evolve in terms of regulations, in terms of policies, not only to push for the climate agenda, but also to implement more restrictions in terms of the impacts generated by the sector. And in that sense, I do believe that the professional organizations, the collectives of architects in terms of how we organize ourselves as a profession, as a discipline, let's say, should also be directly involved and in constant dialogue with states in that sense.
Yeah, and last time we talked, we also discussed the question of sustainable architecture versus regenerative architecture, like how much of what we've already built is worth sustaining and where does it make more sense to create regenerative architecture. How do you see the future of architecture there?
I visualize some scenarios again, and I guess what we are facing is so critical and it's moving so fast that we need different approach to that. First of all, it seems to be clear that the way we produce architecture needs a structural shift, especially in the sense of how we consider good architecture, let's say. I would like to see more discussions as Pedro Galdanho, for example, proposed in terms of what would be the aesthetics values of architecture in the context of the climate crisis, right? What are the solutions that we as architects, as clients, as construction companies admire and would like to have in this new context? Because we're not dealing with the same type of environment we used to when the modern movement started, for example. Then, when we think of a city of São Paulo, for example, we have a larger number of empty flats than homeless people in the city. So this is not a question that architects can answer directly because it's not a technical question, let's say. But if we think of how cities are organized, it's pretty clear that there's something wrong in the way the real estate market and the public policies and the public solutions for housing are established. So the only thing that makes sense to me is that to build this existing infrastructure, we invested a lot of resources and we generated a lot of impacts. So what makes sense to me is to make use of it way before we think of constructing or building something brand new. And then, as you said, when we think of sustainability, even the term sustainability that was a trend decades ago now seems a bit outdated in the sense of sustaining the current conditions seems to not be enough anymore. So then the question for us is if we need to regenerate the environment, what is the role of architecture on that? It's not a simple question, and we are not talking about implementing more gardens in the city, right? It needs to go way beyond that. I don't have very clear answers for that, but I'm pretty sure that we have a role to play. One of the first things that come to my mind is how cities and buildings deal with energy and water. We're going to face more and more scarcity of water, especially in urban areas, at the same time that we are dealing with more and more frequent floods in urban settings. So there is an equation to be addressed in terms of how we make a better use of water, a more sustainable one, at the same time that we use this water to support the process of regenerating the ecological balance, including in urban settings. So this is just an example of how architecture and urban planning can contribute to it.
Going back quickly to the beginning, as you worked in Brazil and had an impact there, or you were working on projects that were environmentally friendly but also had a strong social focus. I'm gonna have an interview in a few weeks with Tomislav from HDM, Herzog De Meuron, the big Swiss architecture firm. Do you know their project in the favela Arena do Morro?
Yes, of course.
I'm interested in hearing your thoughts. I have to say I haven't spoken to them yet, so I'm interested in hearing your thoughts before I talk to them.
Yeah, well, for me, it's a very interesting intervention. First of all, because I guess they managed to do an intervention adequate to the context and the scale. And this is not that simple when we are thinking of a design studio with this scale, right? With such a recognized signature and image and all that. So pretty well consolidated practices tend to impose certain types of solutions and designs and everything. And I guess they did amazingly well in that sense. What they designed and built there, it's not something you're gonna see frequently in their portfolio, for example. But at the same time, when you look at the building, it doesn't come to your mind that was designed by the most important Swiss design company, right? And this for me, it's a very positive sign. And I guess this is more or less what we all should be doing in terms of being a bit more humble. Obviously, iconic buildings, they are important. Cities are recognized for that. It impacts on tourism. I can understand the whole logic behind. And I'm not against it per se. But we need to be really careful with scale, with program, with type of activities, with contexts and all that. I wonder how was the design process in terms of engaging with local actors, local communities, and everything. But I do like the solution. I guess they're using simple materials that make it easier the maintenance for the communities. They scale it's adequate. There is a quite good understanding of the climate conditions and the weather conditions in this region. So the how the building breathes is really efficient. That helps a lot. It's a very warm environment there. So yeah, in general, I see it as a very, very positive intervention.
That's wonderful. I'll tell them your opinion. Just one last question, Fabiano. From your diverse international experience, could you highlight a sustainable project or structure that has inspired you?
I've been seeing some very interesting stuff out there. It's interesting because the first one that comes to my mind is the work of Alejandro Hayek. That for many years developed very interesting interventions in communities in Venezuela. And Alejandro has a very interesting approach to the design process, especially from the community engagement perspective we were discussing before. And this is, for me, the most important aspect of his work. So the process might take years in terms of building trust and creating the conditions, and these also involves increasing the community's capacity to dialogue, to participate in the design process before something is designed, before something is installed in a community. So these urban equipments, they are fantastic solutions because they bring this whole process to create something that, visually speaking, are really iconic in terms of having marks in the community that the community can recognize, but at the same time they are pretty immersive. We can see a bit of a relationship with the project in Brazil you were mentioning, and that's why I was asking myself how they did it there, because for me the process it's more important than the beauty itself, because in the end this is what we need to not only put architects on the ground in terms of seeing ourselves as just another worker in this process, not as a great designer that creates something and that kind of thing, and how communities will take these processes and structures and buildings and spaces as their own. If they are not part of this process, it's not likely that we're going to see this level of engagement and this level of ownership that, for me, especially when we are talking about very complex and challenging contexts, is what really matters. We need to move from the idea that the whole system, including communities, are there to serve architects so then we can design our dreams, to go to the other way around, that is what we can offer, right? What is our role in these small contributions we might have in these social transformation processes. And as we see social inequality and all the conflicts, all the crises being exacerbated by the climate crisis, I guess this way of thinking, this way of acting, it's going to be more and more a necessity in our field.
That's a wonderful ending. Thank you so much, Fabiano. It has been very inspiring talking to you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me again.
A huge thank you for listening. Make sure you subscribe to the show wherever you listen to the podcast to support me and so you don't miss an episode. And while you're there, I'd also be so grateful if you could rate and review us. If you have any guest suggestions or any feedback, you can find me on the socials at LadinaShipf. Thanks.